I just wanted to show you that the actual files that I will leave with Jose as a whole folder, they comprise of the presentations that I gave yesterday and today, and also a whole lot of other stuff, a material that you're free to use. It includes the budget, for example, but also the financial guides, frequent asked questions about international cooperation, responsible partnering, all kinds of other useful background details. So please have a look at that folder. There's more than what I actually explained in the presentation itself. Okay, let's have a look at the budget table then quickly. This is a budget table that I've set up for you as a tool to use. It's non-protective. You can change any cell, any formula, any worksheet, whatever you like. And you should, because you should use this as a tool to adapt to the particular project budget and the structure of the budget of the project that you are working with. The structure is such that I have a summary sheet which summarizes the actual costs for research and for management. As I said, these are split. And each of these cells have a link to other sheets where the actual calculation of the figures are done. So this is the summary sheet, and with the summary sheet you can see the totals here. Of course, all the figures are just an example. They come from an actual project, so the calculations are all active, but it gives you a glimpse of the structure of a budget, and a copy of this summary table is what you put into the proposal. And you help and use that to the evaluator to convince that you know how you have developed that budget. Now, in detail, these are the partners. This is a fairly big project, 11 partners. We're talking about more than 2 million euros. Here you see the total, well, almost. And that is the subsidy. You see that here the totals and the subsidy are the same, while for the research the totals and the subsidy are not the same. That is why here the subsidy is a little bit less than the total. That reflects the percentage of subsidy as I explained earlier. You also see that on the research that the first line is here manpower. That is the number of person months that each partner has. So this partner 1, has 65 person months for research and 7.5 person months for management. Obviously, these are the leading partners for the management, and the rest are just follower partners for management. But the other partners actually do a lot of research, except for this one. This one is only for management and has no research. You see? Now the second line here is that converting these person months into actual euros. And I will show you in a minute how that is done. And then the travel subsistence, other costs, equipment is inserted, and that's added up to a total, and then overheads are added up on top of that, arriving at the total cost. Now how do you calculate those person months? I have a separate sheet here. I repeat every partner here, and for every single work package I estimate what is the actual work effort in that work package. Now we have even split within the work package individual tasks. So you see at this level there's 32 person months for this work package for this partner. And to arrive at the 32, you see task 1, task 2, task 3. You do the same thing for work package 2 and 3, etc. So if you build up this, your totals come in automatically. How to calculate the manpower person months into euros? I've set up a separate sheet here where I calculate what is the average person cost per month in that partner. This partner, for example, has 3,800 euros per month as actual institutional cost for salaries. And this is something that relates to FP6, so I will explain later. And that is the actual overhead rate they use. You see that the salary levels here in this Latin American project are far lower than the ones in Europe. So each partner has their own average salary cost. If you have senior personnel and junior personnel, you split the two. Now this average is then used here. You convert here, for example, these 32, sorry, where is it? Here, 32, that is the sum of the person months for this work package, is then multiplied by the actual salary cost per month coming from the assumption sheet. And that gives you the euros per month for the 32 person months for that partner in this work package. And this amount is then copied back into the summary sheet. Okay? Now the same way you do for travel and subsistence and other costs, each partner type of expense per work package, and you can take average sums. For a field trip is so much on the average, and that way you can build up your total budget. For example, under assumptions, in this case we said Europe, Latin America trips cost about 2,000 euro. That is an average, and that's a good start. Intra-European travel between European countries is far less. So if you use that as a base, you can start building up your budget individually. And then finally, with equipment, you need to pay attention. I am sure all of you know, equipment needs to be depreciated. So if you buy, for example, a computer, many universities have the internal rule that computer equipment is depreciated, spread out over 3 years. So you buy the computer for 2,000 euro, you have 660 euros each year that you actually use it in the project. That means if you buy the computer in the 3rd year, you can use only 1 year of the depreciation. And the other 2 years are outside the scope of the project. So be aware that if you use equipment, try to buy it early in the project and fully benefit from the total amount of depreciation time. Heavy equipment in laboratories is usually depreciated by 5 years. Centrifuges, HPLC equipment, things like that, analytical testing equipment. Infrastructure is not equipment. And infrastructure generally is not eligible under research projects. So be careful with that. But if you have to adapt a laboratory to install testing equipment for a project, and you have to put in an extra electricity line, I mean, that is a small thing that can still be part of the expenses. But not to replace and rebuild a lab, and that is outside research expenses.
Can you explain, sorry,
yeah.
How do I benefit from this depreciation element? I buy this laptop in first year.
Yeah.
So
and you use it through 3 years of the project, and you have fully depreciated the full cost of the computer.
If I buy in second year?
If you buy in the 2nd year, only in the 2nd and the 3rd year of a 3-year project, you can depreciate.
So I'm not understanding my benefit there.
No, the benefit is done. There's not a benefit. The problem is that by accounting rules, you have to depreciate equipment. Almost every university has that rule.
Yeah.
Small equipment, smaller things like tabletop centrifuge, pipette tips, those kind of things are not depreciated.
But what I'm saying
so
is,
there you have the full cost in once at the moment that you buy.
If I have it in the budget, and for some reason I delay buying that until the 2nd year,
then you get less refund. And
less refund from who?
From the European Commission.
Because remember, you have to spread the cost over the 3 years. You're not paying for it all up front in the 1st year. It's spread over until it's fully depreciated in the 3rd year.
Yeah.
That is general accounting.
Although you're buying it cash, when you account there, it's... okay.
Indeed. So also the subsidies will come in year 2 and 3 in your example. Heavy equipment is usually depreciated over long term. You may say, I do not get it fully refunded, but on the other hand, you own the equipment. And you're fully eligible to, or allowed to sell your equipment after the project. And then you get the full price. If you make a profit then, fine, no problem. So there's the balance.
Frank, another question about equipment. Let's suppose you have to buy a few parts or something. It's not really the actual prototype, whatever.
You use your internal rule for depreciation, and if it's small parts, like you have a laptop and you buy a battery, that's consumables. So you don't depreciate the battery.
But If it was originally part of your equipment budget where you had to buy these parts to make that piece of equipment, let's suppose you were developing a prototype thing and you had to buy those parts, so you put it under your equipment vote, is that allowed?
It's not usual. The usual thing is that you put it under consumables. Of course, you can justify for the European Commission it does not make any difference. You need to convince your auditor.
Okay.
I can tell you that for FP7 now the rule is that if you need to make shifts between categories, that is allowed. You don't even have to ask permission for small shifts, like 5, maybe 10%. That is usually accepted without problem. If you make major shifts, you really have to ask permission up front, but it is allowed. While in FP6 and other funding programs, it's very rigid and you cannot shift between categories. So this is one of the main benefits of FP7 I can find. It's far more flexible in this way than other funding agencies I can see. So I hope this is roughly understandable. Now going back to the presentation.
Sorry, just going back. This template here, well, I can see it's a very good template. When you are writing the proposal, is there a template like that, or this is your own creation?
No, this is my own creation.
Because
there's not a fixed format for this kind of thing. So you can make your own template and just copy it into the proposal.
Yeah, because
and I would urge you to adapt it to the needs of the project. If the needs of the project says you need more detail here and less detail there, fine.
This is good because why I'm saying that, you see, in my other project, this summary that you've got seemed to be the rigid thing that I was supposed to input things.
No.
Now, when it came to accounting, I now had problems because, you see, there was no way in there where there was a workshop or training course. I see now you have it there, which is what I like.
You add additional lines, you can add an additional lines for subcontracting or for a special conference. You adapt it to your needs of your project.
Yeah.
And of course, if you have less partners, you eliminate a number of columns. It's the principle from how you build and work with the Excel sheet that I want to demonstrate. But it's up to you to make a table that in the proposal, you only need to copy the table that helps the evaluator to understand how you develop the budget.
If you say workshop has got implications on personnel. So are you going again to come and specify personnel under workshop? Because when you say workshop,
some agencies, like the ACP, they request to do that. For FP7, I've never seen that.
You can just put a lump sum. And then you buy the tickets from that lump sum?
Yes, and you explain in the justification, in the text, how you arrive and how you will use them. You explain that the workshop lump sum consists of personnel, consists of other expenses, etc. No, there are no rules there. You can be your own judge what is the level of detail you need to convince the evaluator. Well, in the presentation itself, as I said here, it's an example, but it's freely adaptable. You can actually work with it to model and adapt your budget while you're building your proposal together with other partners. So if you need to stay below the maximum allowed, in the call, for example, it says 3 million euro subsidy. You have to be underneath that ceiling. So sometimes you have to shift budgets between partners until you have a good balance and you're still below the ceiling. Now, using a table like this, you can just modify 1 or 2 figures in a worksheet and the table automatically recalculates. So you can really model. You can manipulate the figures so that you find the right balance. And you don't have to do all the calculations by hand again. You can use the same thing during negotiation. If the European Commission requests changes in the budget before they sign the contract, you do the same thing. You make small changes in the worksheet and the whole summary table is automatically recalculated. And even more important, you can use it as a monitoring tool during the project. Because if you just take that Excel sheet and you have your budget, sorry, this has shifted, but you take your budget and you, for say, for a 2-year project, you divide that budget per year, and then you monitor the actual expenses. Then every year, every half year you can do it, every quarter of a year you can do it. You can monitor how far are we progressing through our budget. Are there items where we are overspending? Are there items where we're underspending? And you can use that to steer your management. And that is very useful because quite often at the end of the project there are problems and you're missing budget in certain categories. But if you use this as an evolving table during the project, you can immediately see where the problems in the expenses are. And that really, really helps with your reporting and your actual project management itself. So that's a simple thing. And you can also immediately see, maybe I need to close this window. But you can immediately detect early on, before your official reporting, if there's a problem or not. Okay, if you're ready, we just go to the intellectual property issues. And again, if you have further questions in details, I'd love to discuss you after lunch in further detail. There's no problem at all. I talked about contracts. Now, the contract for FP7 project is fairly simple. The actual grant agreement, as it's called, is just 1 or 2 pages. It only says European Commission as one party, consortium and a coordinator is the other party. Commission promises to send so much money for this project for this amount of time, and the consortium promises to deliver. Signatures, that's it. The actual detail is here. The technical detail is in the Annex 1, and the Annex 1 to the contract is the technical description of what you promised to do. That is based on your proposal, but it will not be exactly the same. Some chapters are taken out, like the chapters about scientific references, contact details. Those are not legally important, they're taken out. But what is in there are the tables with deliverables, tables with milestones, your Gantt chart for time planning, and of course your budget. So here, the conversion of proposal during negotiation into a legal document, Annex 1, that is the time when you can still make small changes. If you realize after a year, now you enter into negotiations, and you realize that some deliverable should actually be in the year 2 instead of year 1. Or a deliverable should not be 50 but 40. You still can make those small changes. You cannot change anything fundamental to the project. So you cannot take out a partner or so. Then you have a problem during negotiation. So keep in mind that the Annex 1 is not a copy of your proposal. It's a legal part that describes what you promise to do. The Annex 2 talks about finances, intellectual property, access rights, exploitation rights, access, the financial distributions, responsibilities and liabilities. What if? If you do not perform, what happens? If there is a conflict, a dispute, what happens? You go to which court, or you have an arbitrary committee, or whatever. Usually this is not changed. The standard Annex 2 forms that you can download from Cordis, and you just need to compare the Annex 2 that the European Commission will send you with the standard form on Cordis and see if there's 1 or 2 clauses that are changed. But usually there are not many. Here, this is what you have to write as a consortium. So the Commission will not tell you that. They just ask you, convert your proposal into an Annex 1. And then there may be other annexes as appropriate. For example, for the Marie Curie programs, they have Annex 3 and 4, which have very specific conditions related to the Marie Curie program. And that is the general structure of the contract that will be signed. And the coordinator signs on behalf of the whole consortium. And then there is a small form, just 1 page, that the coordinator will send to you to adhere to the contract. And you need to sign that, and only if your institute's representative signs it, then the university enters into contract. That is the website on Cordis where you can find all these documents. So please have a look at them, download them into your office and discuss them with your legal department so that they're familiar with this and they're not just scared when you all of a sudden dump this contract on their desk and say, now we need to sign and now it's urgent. By that time usually they start, no, I need to study this. All of this is online. So you can tell them up front, this is the structure to work with. So can somebody reset, or is it automatic? Okay.
Why is it doing that though? I don't understand.
Every 2 hours,
Just to make sure I don't talk for more than 2 hours.
like an internal exercise. Huh? Yeah, what else was related there? During the negotiations, yes, let me explain you one other thing that I mentioned yesterday already. This is the contract between the whole consortium and the coordinator with the European Commission. That is like a framework contract. But underneath there you have the different partners, and you need to agree among the partners how you collaborate together. And that is agreed in the consortium agreement. So that is a separate contract underneath the contract with the European Commission. So in the consortium agreement, I will have a checklist of items that you need to take into account there. There you agree between the coordinator and the other partners, how do you distribute the money, how do you report, what happens if, what are the responsibilities, who gets how much money, and all the intellectual property issues that I will discuss in a minute. So the consortium agreement, you can actually restrict freedom, while the European Commission leaves you far more free. And this is especially relevant if you work with industry, and I will give a few examples there. Industry is eager to get market access to protect their rights and exploit in an exclusive way. So there is already a friction with what you do in a university. So be aware of this as a framework, but consortium agreements are or partnership agreements are far more detailed. And you really have to spend time on the consortium or partnership agreements to make sure that your rights are protected. Now this is a checklist, and I will have further checklist for you. But what you can find in these partnership agreements are usually the technical roles and responsibilities. Are you a subcontractor? Are you a main partner? Are you a work package leader? Which work packages are you responsible for and which are you not involved? And that relates to ownership. Who is in the management? Are you part of that management or not? If so, what are your responsibilities in the management of the project? How is the reporting organized inside the project? The European Commission may ask only once a year a report, but the partners can agree to have an informal report every 6 months to keep track of progress more frequently. Financial provisions, of course, and the exploitation issues. Now the main issues here under IPR are first of all confidentiality issues. How do you share knowledge within the consortium completely free, or are there certain areas that you need to keep confidential? Also as a university you need to keep certain information confidential. Information that you have to keep confidential because you have signed a confidentiality agreement with an industry partner or with another academic partner. So that information you cannot just share without permission. And information that knowledge that you generate that could be protected by a patent. That needs to be kept confidential too. So that's a whole issue that I have 1 or 2 slides more on that. That is really important to discuss with your scientists. Most scientists in academia are not used to that. And they think, well, confidentiality issues only for industry. Not entirely. And then the knowledge you generate, how do you transfer that? Who owns the knowledge? Of course, any scientist will say, what I discover, I own. Maybe. Maybe the university owns, not the scientist. That is the default case for most universities. It's the university who owns, so the university decides what to do and how to transfer and how to protect, not the individual scientist. Think about it, whether that is a part of the partnership, the personnel contract or not. If it's not specified, then the scientist may walk away with that knowledge. Good university practice is that it's part of the personnel contract. If a scientist works in a university, the university supplies with the laboratory and the space, so the university pays his salary or her salary, university owns. But if it's not specified in the contract, so talk with the HR department whether that is specified. And it's particularly relevant in the case of people who come in temporarily from abroad. What if a German scientist comes here for 2 months, they discover here something and they walk away with it? Who owns the knowledge? Your university or the German university who pays his salary? You need to make some agreement there. Who owns, if you work together and you invite the scientist into the lab or into the institute, who owns that knowledge coming out? And then what about students? They're not paid. They don't have an HR contract. Do they own?
But Frank, we don't have ours in the HR contract, but we have an IP policy that states that the university owns the IP, blah, 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 and how it's shared.
Does all staff, they sign that they will adhere to the policy?
No, we don't have that.
Talk to your HR and your lawyer, because it might be a hole in the regulation. And it's not important for normal cases, but the moment that you have a patent that is really valuable, or an industry contract of a few million euros, then it will suddenly become very important. So it's better be safe than sorry in these cases.
It must be implied in the general conditions of service that by accepting the job, you are actually...
So that relates to this. And in some countries, just be aware that in some countries, there is no institutional inventorship. Like in Sweden, it's the individual scientist who owns, and the university has nothing to say about it. This was the default position in Germany until 2001, when they changed the law. And since 2001, German universities have set up knowledge transfer offices, and they had to learn what is the institutional policy about the IPR. They had never had to think about it before. So there are some legal changes that sometimes have a big difference, and don't assume that all countries have the same legal landscape there. Then, of course, there is the difference between background and foreground. I have another slide on that. Who owns what relates sometimes to background, and that can be tricky. For example, if you have samples in your freezer that you got on loan for research purposes from somebody else, you use that, you make an invention. Who owns the invention? You or the other university? Who is co-inventor on the patent? You need to think about these things up front, and especially with materials, organisms, plants, DNA, vaccines, antibodies, those kind of things. So good practice to regulate the ownership is a very simple material transfer agreement, 1 or 2 pages. But please teach your scientists that they do sign. They tell you that they transfer material to somebody else or receive, and that there is an MTA behind it. You can really make a difference there if you teach and change the culture in the university that this is not a big item, just a simple thing to sign. Same with confidentiality agreements. These are very simple, but they can prevent a lot of trouble. Of course, here in the agreements, you also specify what role you have. Are you a full partner with full rights to foreground you develop together and the rights to get access to knowledge of others? Or are you a simple subcontractor where all the work is paid and somebody else owns? That can be very beneficial and very easy. If you don't want to own, you don't have to. Subcontractor can be very beneficial, easy. You can charge a higher price and you do your work. But full partner has rights, but also obligations. And then we talk about access rights and users' rights. that has nothing to do with commercialization alone. Access rights can be as simple as, I've developed an antibody, I sell it in a license to somebody else. Do I still have the right to use that antibody for my own research? I've seen the examples in Mexico where people have given away their material and all of a sudden they cannot do research anymore on the material they have developed themselves because they signed away their access rights. It can be very painful.
Frank, I have a question that...
Yes.
What if you are doing research that involves like communities that have indigenous knowledge and so on?
Very good question.
How is that one handled? I mean, if they you have worked with them and gotten the knowledge from them that this particular plant is beneficial, you then take it to the lab, you analyze, you find the components, and then you find that it does have some benefits. Then you want to put a patent. What do you do with that community that has given you some information about what to say?
Thank you for answering the question, because that is a really tricky situation and it does happen all the time. We had a situation like that when I was responsible for the IPR department in our company. We had worked with indigenous communities, in this case in Vietnam, but we also had contacts in Africa and in Brazil. And at that moment in time there were no biodiversity acts like South Africa has now. Many countries still don't have a regulatory directive at the national level. So it's sort of a vague field where in the past some big companies have just barged in, taken away the knowledge, given nothing back. So since the Rio Convention, which was in the late 80s I think, this is illegal, but it still happened. Quite back into the 80s and 90s, it still happened. Now there are more stringent regulations on biodiversity, and South Africa has one of the most strict laws in the world at that level. Maybe even too strict, but that's a different issue. The way we did it, and there may be other ways, but the way we handled this as a small Belgian company was we worked with the community. The community is a group of people, so there's not a single inventor there. So they were not inventor on the patent. But we did agree up front, before we discovered anything, in an agreement that we would give a fair return to the community. And the way we did it in this specific case was we built a school for the community. We trained technicians to work in a local institute close to the community, and we trained people to collect the plants for us that will be used in the institute. So there was a chain. The community got something in their own villages. We had workers that were trained to collect and harvest in a controlled way, which was good for us because we knew that the material was collected in a controlled, high-quality way. It was good for them because it provided them jobs and education. And in the institute, where all this material from the communities was collected, dried, extracted, and the material was prepared for sending to Belgium for further processing, we trained technicians and we donated some of the equipment. So no royalties here, but very substantial payments related to milestones of the development program.
So
the extracted material was then sent to Belgium, and where we went in the lab and we separated the active ingredient and we converted this into a medical drug.
So why couldn't they get royalties in that case?
Because there's not a single inventor. Who do you give the royalties to? That is the problem. So we had to give it to the community, not to that one person that happened to collect the plant.
So like an NGO in the community they have been the recipient of that royalty?
In this case there was no NGO.
Okay.
So if there is an NGO working on behalf of the community, that is a legal entity you can enter into contract with.
Okay.
But in this case it was a community. People collecting plants, medicinal doctor who knew how to use the plants, the chief of the group, the tribe, who would be the signatory on the contract.
Yeah, but perhaps from an ethical point of view, you could at that point, start that entity. I mean, once you have discovered something, you say, to transfer this knowledge, now we'll need an entity to be countersignated.
Yeah. No, as I said, we did it this way. There are other options, and maybe that would have been a very good way. The point I wanted to make is a different one. to give a fair return to a community is not so easy. You have to calculate what are the future benefits. Is it worth to agree on royalties or on milestones and upfront payments? And in this case, the community was far better off with upfront payments. And because this was medicine for tropical disease, there was no big profit in any foreseeable future. So royalties would have given them almost nothing. And worse, they would have shared the risk. And they would have to wait 10 years before the royalties would start to come in. Now, end of story is that we sold the company to Johnson & Johnson. This was the first project that was killed. Because Johnson & Johnson said, we don't do tropical diseases that have no market. So the project was developed with aid from the WHO. WHO was not capable of bringing this alone to the market, and the project was stopped. Still feel hurt about it. It was a Leishmaniasis project, and it was quite good and effective clinically, but no market. So if we would have agreed on royalties, the community would have received absolutely nothing. And this unfortunately happens all the time, especially for tropical diseases where the market conditions are so non-commercial.
But I'm trying to understand when you say no market, because there are so many people with these diseases.
Yes, but the market is the size of the profits and the turnover, not the number of people. Think of malaria. How many big pharma companies are investing in malaria? There's 600 million people with malaria. You would think that is a huge market. It's not. The profits are so small that they don't want to invest in big programs. Only now, with the Gates Foundation and the Malaria Venture Fund, the first academic groups are joining industries and the first new treatments are being tested. But I have not seen one single big pharma company who have squarely put a full development program and their own investments in there. Not even GlaxoSmithKline. They have research projects, no development projects. And the ballpark figure in Johnson & Johnson was any market that is smaller than 150 million euro, we will not even touch. It's brutal. But that is big industry. So the only way to do that is with small industry, with academia, with subsidies, but not a full commercial big industry will touch that. Yes?
I want to come back to the point of confidentiality.
Yes.
Basically, here you've been referring more towards partnership agreement or grants or contract as a whole. But I want to reflect within the ORD, Office of Research Management, as to even within the administration as a whole. How is the confidentiality has to be handled, especially as we deal with the researchers, we deal with the finance people and outside. How could you give us maybe a light as to handle it? Because
part of the answer is maybe in one of the further slides. Let me skip this one. That's a funny story, but I'll skip that one in time. I can explain later. Let me just zip forward and then I'll come back to this slide later. Let me see. It's related to here, I think. No, this one. What happens if a student works in your laboratory or in your institute and then all of a sudden starts to talk about the research results that have not been published yet? Your researcher would go nuts. What happens if you have a young scientist working in your institute that is very excited about new research findings and then subscribes to a conference in the weekend because the deadline is before Monday? They subscribe with an abstract to talk about this research in a conference. And then on Monday they hear from their director, oh, but you cannot talk about that. We haven't talked about patenting and protection yet. Too late, because the abstract was submitted to the conference. That is already publication, and the whole thing cannot be published, patented anymore. So be super alert on those conditions. In the social sciences, this may be less important because in the humanities and social sciences, it's very rare you have a patent protection issue. You do have confidentiality issues. For example, I got a question in Algeria when I talked about this, and there was a lady, a dean from Faculty of Social Science, and she said, I don't care about patents, we don't need confidentiality agreements. And I said, well, first of all, you probably conduct surveys, you probably collect a lot of private data about people that give you their telephone numbers and backgrounds and very personal information. Don't they have to, a right to keep that information confidential? And what do you do with your databases with all that information? If it's confidential information in the databases, how do you protect it? And you don't put a link on your website so that anybody can hack and go into the databases. So confidentiality issues, copyright issues are also relevant for humanities and social sciences. Maybe less in commercial terms, but in terms of ethical conduct, yes.
Yeah, now that we're here, would you, I'm thinking of also data in the publications. In one of my projects, and I want to know whether we will be adequately covered by that, we have developed what we call a data sharing policy for the project, which this project leader gives me the rights to have all the data at a central place, although the researchers do keep their data and how we will deal with that. Then we have got a communication strategy for the project. Do we still need to enter into some confidentiality agreements, or that is adequate to say when you are working in the project, usually comply with this?
Usually what I said before, in the partnership agreement, there is one chapter about confidentiality. So you can enter it into the partnership agreement. You do not need to sign 20 individual confidentiality agreements. But it depends on the project and the structure. Who needs to sign a confidentiality agreement, who not?
Because it's exactly what we are saying. We have, like that project has got 6 PhD students. So they are working with their mentors. So it's very important how the information is used, because there's a distinction between what they are using for their PhD and what they are collecting generally for that working.
Indeed. Yeah.
So we need to protect them as well, so that they have a meaningful.
That's one thing, and the other thing is protect versus time to publish, meaning that you need to protect that confidentiality until you allow the people who own knowledge to investigate whether it is worth to patent and protect or not. And a good practice is, especially if you work with industry here, is that you allow a communication line. If there is an invention, or you think that there is an invention, you first tell your industry partners or the other project partners, and you allow them 6 or 8 weeks to investigate whether it's worth it to patent and whether it's interesting for everybody. And they have to come up with an answer within that specified period of time. If they do not come back, then you're ready to publish. So that way, there's a balance between protecting knowledge and still being able to publish your scientific results. And 6 to 8 weeks is enough to deposit a patent application, really. Especially for an industry member, if they're good organized and they're eager to have a patent, 6 to 8 weeks is enough. And after the patent application is entered, you can publish, because eventually patents will be published anyway, and that is the purpose of a patent. To protect the market, but share the knowledge in public.
But it might not be the patent, it might just be if the industry decides that I should not publish what is very interesting.
Of course, the industry in general, they would like to keep things secret, and then you have to negotiate. And you have to agree up front that you do have the right to publish certain things, or you get a benefit in another way in return. Because for an academic institute, it's important to have enough publications. For the industry, it's important to have their products protected, the market with the products protected. So that is 2 different and sometimes opposing objectives. And you have to agree from how valuable is it to publish versus the value you get back from your industry partner if they bring a product to the market. And it's not unlimited. I mean, a patent will always be public at some point. Usually after 1.5 years, when the patent application gets into the next phase, then it will be in a patent database searchable. So in industry, if they want to patent, they cannot bar you from publishing forever. If they want to keep it completely secret as an industrial secret, they have to give you some fair return in another way. For example, better upfront payments, or promise of co-development, or maybe shares in the company, or I don't know what. That is part of a negotiation. Now there's one other thing. I mentioned material transfer issues already, but this is another one that is quite often forgotten in collaboration with industry. It's quite important if you're working in labs with industry that the material that you send out to the industry partner has gone through some quality control. Because the worst is if you send, for example, you develop an antibody, and that antibody is in a certain quantity in your freezer. You give some samples to the industry, they do research with it, and after a while, a year, they say, well, yes, we would like to have more. And they say, well, now our stock is gone, we will make new antibody. But if the production process of that antibody is different, because you use different ingredients, you incubate a little bit different, or you use a different batch of cells, the quality of the antibody will be different. And your industry partner will not be happy, I can assure you, because they make their decisions on their previous finding. They want to have consistency of quality and control of quality process. So what do you need for that? Is lab records on how do you develop that first antibody so that you can exactly replicate next time. And if there is an uncertainty, that they can find back where the uncertainty is. Is it in the water, in the cells, in the ingredients? This is ethical, good research conduct. Lab records. Lab records are also very important to determine who actually did the invention. Is it just a scientist or actually his director, because his director wants to have the benefit of the invention? But you need to demonstrate that. And especially in disputes later, if somebody else comes up towards the patent office and says, no, I invented this earlier, so I have preference over the patent. You need to demonstrate your lab books that you were the first. So keeping lab books are very, very important to demonstrate your innovative aspect and your priority aspect for patents. And also the quality control that keep your industry happy. It's quite difficult to work with lab records with students, so you have to train them. Lab records can be in any form, a bound book with signatures on every page, or an electronic record that is kept in copy elsewhere so that it cannot be modified later by date. All of that is fine, as long as it's consistent and it cannot be modified post hoc. That's the only thing that is important for patenting. But quality control issues are really an issue. The second thing that are necessary there are standard operating procedures, SOPs. At some point when you actually work with industry on a consistent basis and you supply the materials regularly, you need standard operating procedures. I've seen quite a lot of startup companies who start in the lab of an academic lab. They share centrifuges, equipment, etc., testing analytical equipment. And at the very first start, that's fine. But the moment that they start to standardize their procedures, it's better to separate that out and have their own equipment and their own supplies and not share it with academics because of the standard operating procedures. It's very hard to control scientists to use exactly the same bottle, exactly the same grade ingredients, exactly the same maintenance of the testing equipment, because they always want to modify. Even the calibration of a balance, as simple as that, will need to be calibrated in a very specific way if you work with GMP type of products, for example. So the industry may have different needs for quality control than are possible in an academic lab. So be aware of that and ask. When they arrive at such a problem, then it's better to buy separate equipment, put them in a room aside, and let them do their own experiments there. to avoid a lot of discussion and heated discussions later. I've seen that quite often. So these are issues that are key when you collaborate with industry. Just to finish off a few slides so that you know what is in the presentation, and we can go in more detail later if you like. This is a definition of the difference between background and foreground. This is some points that you should discuss with your lawyers about access rights. There are some pain points here that could be quite difficult to deal with. It's a general table as a summary for what usually is the default position to deal with access rights. That is a very useful website, IPR Help Desk, where you, again, like the Finance Help Desk, you can ask questions, you get answers, in this case even 6 languages, in 3-4 days. And they also have a lot of model agreements, so you don't have to start from scratch. You can use these model agreements as a base to start with. And Lambert Agreements website has a lot of model standard agreements for the simple ones, like a collaborative agreement between one university and one industry, or an NDA, or a material transfer agreements. You can find them there. Quite useful. And that is a useful website, which I will explain later for those who are interested really in partnerships with industry. I will give you the copies of all the presentations, so no need to do that. That's the RPL Health Desk. They have newsletters, bulletins, workshops, all kinds of things. And ownership issues, access right issues. Again, a checklist. I can talk hours about this, but liabilities. That's always a pain point. People tend to forget liabilities. They always think that the research project will go on as planned. But what do you do if it's not planned? If a partner walks out, if a partner does not perform, do you have a plan B? It's quite important to think about it up front, and then hopefully never have to use it. And some misconceptions I can discuss and give actual cases as examples. So that, actually this is the last slide here. That's the way to collaborate and avoid these negotiations that are ending up in fighting battles, like the slide I showed you. If you really cooperate, also during the negotiations, and see who benefits from both sides, then you build partnerships, and you never look at the grants, at the contracts anymore, but you build partnerships over time. And like an orchestra, not play one concert, but build like a family where you can do many concerts together. And to me, that is really a good image of actual research management. It has all the aspects of it. So, sorry if I'm rushing a little bit, but I'd be free in the afternoon to really go in more detail on the industry collaboration issues, because there are a lot of questions, I guess. Yeah.
There's somewhere where this has been a lot of information, just like in chronological order, what the template looks like.
Yeah, no, that's important.
Yeah.
Especially bearing in mind that we expected somehow to take this knowledge beyond our...
Oh yes, absolutely. But what I said yesterday, I hope that you use these presentations just as a basis to start thinking from which workshops would you like to develop your own and give here. And then we work together, and I can give you much more information and other templates and slides for topics that you want to zoom in. So if, for example, if you want to give a separate workshop of a day about intellectual property issues, fine. I have plenty of material for a full day I can share with you. That is not a problem. And the same with finance and budgeting.
What did you mean,
Yeah, what I meant is, the template I meant
the
is
forms to fill in, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
The sequence, it could be just, this template has got background.
Maybe when you go up to make the phone call, have the forms changed significantly from FP6, or they are about the same?
I'm confused because for intellectual property issues you have no
No.
forms.
No, he's finished with
Yeah.
what I think.
Yeah,
He's
Okay.
now
yeah,
proposing
It's the general,
application
everything we
form.
started yesterday up to
Okay.
now.
No, there it's very simple. You go to the Cordis websites that I showed you. If you download the information package for a call, one of the documents there, for each call there is a guide for applicants. They have the forms in, with all the explanation how to fill in the forms. So each call has their own guide for applicants, and the forms are in there.
Frank, have they
Some
changed?
calls have different forms.
They have, okay, so
Yes.
they have changed from FP6, you think?
Even between calls they're different.
Oh, okay.
So a call for SMEs will have, for example, a different form than the calls for large collaborative projects, and will have a different form for the People's Exchange programs.
Okay, 'cause
As I said
thought-
yesterday, you really need to download the guide of applicants for that particular call. And there you will find a very good explanation of how to fill in the forms. They're very detailed.
Yeah, but still, what is comment is still valid, is that for what you presented to us now,
Yes.
how would you sequence which PowerPoint goes with? I mean, rather, how do you identify those within the package that you've given us?
Well, what I tried to do yesterday is to give, just as a summary, to give first the kind of questions and preparations that you need to do before you start selecting a call. And then the kind of steps that you can take to find additional partners to form your consortium, and then select a call that is appropriate for that project and consortium. Then you download from the call the different forms that you need, and you fill in those forms that are particular for that call. So that is the sequence. And then in the afternoon yesterday, I gave you an example of a generic form that is applicable for most of the projects. You will find that structure of part A and part B with the science, management, and the impact sector. You will find that as a general structure in many of the forms. But some calls are slightly different, and they have subheadings or they have an extra chapter or so. But the general format is what I showed you yesterday afternoon. And what today, I tried to give you an idea from, okay, once you are starting to fill in the form, you need to think about budgets and about impact and exploitation and intellectual property. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of information. I understand that in 1.5 days you're flooded. So please reflect on this, go back to the presentations, listen to the recording of the video, and look at and think critically from where is the information you're still lacking, and which areas of the workshops you would like to develop yourself, and then come back with feedback to me, and together we can fill that workshop with material that we have. Or you can develop your own material and bounce it off to me and see from, are there any mistakes, should I present it differently or so. So I can also act as a mirror, if you like.
I have an example here that I can share with people. While you make the phone call, then we can
Yes,
work up
please.
until maybe another 15 to 20 minutes. I can show an example of what the call looks like and the application form and so on.